Yo, what is going on, everybody? Testing output 001 here. Have you ever wondered how peaceful protests can suddenly turn chaotic? You know, one minute people are holding signs, chanting slogans, the next it's all tear gas and rubber bullets. It's a complex issue with a whole bunch of factors at play, and today we're diving deep into 5 instances where protests that started peacefully took a hard turn into chaos. Buckle up, because this is going to be a wild ride. We're going to look at everything from the motivations of the protesters to the tactics used by law enforcement and try to understand how things can escalate so quickly. This isn't about pointing fingers or taking sides. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of these pivotal moments in history. Let's get started. August 1968, Chicago, the Democratic National Convention. Picture it. Tens of thousands of protesters all gathered to voice their opposition to the Vietnam War. The energy was palpable, a mix of anger, frustration, and hope for change. These weren't just seasoned activists. There were students, teachers, everyday folks who felt compelled to take a stand. The initial days of the protest were largely peaceful, with demonstrators holding signs, chanting slogans, and engaging in open discussions. There was a sense of unity, a shared belief that their voices could make a difference. But the atmosphere started to shift. The police presence intensified and tensions began to rise. The city's mayor, Richard Daley, was determined to maintain order, and he wasn't afraid to use force to do so. On August 28th, the situation reached a boiling point. As protesters marched towards the convention center, they were met with a wall of police officers, armed with batons and tear gas. What followed was a brutal crackdown, with officers indiscriminately attacking protesters, journalists, and even bystanders. The images of that night are seared into the American consciousness: bloodied protesters, clouds of tear gas, and a nation seemingly on the brink of chaos. The violence that erupted at the 1968 Democratic National Convention became a symbol of the deep divisions within American society. It raised serious questions about freedom of speech, the role of law enforcement, and the government's response to dissent. The events of that summer had a profound impact on the anti-war movement, fueling further protests and deepening the polarization that was gripping the nation. Fast forward to 2010, Toronto, Canada, the G20 summit. Leaders from the world's most powerful nations descended upon the city, and with them came a wave of protests. This time the focus was on global economic policies, with demonstrators railing against corporate greed, social inequality, and the perceived failures of capitalism. The protests drew a diverse crowd. Environmental activists, anti-poverty groups, union members, and concerned citizens, all united in their discontent with the status quo. The initial demonstrations were largely peaceful, with protesters marching through the streets, holding rallies, and engaging in creative forms of protest. There was a carnival-like atmosphere at times, with music, street performers, and a sense of shared purpose. But as the summit progressed, so too did the tension. A massive security operation was in place, with a heavy police presence throughout the city. The police were on high alert, determined to prevent a repeat of the violence that had marred previous G20 summits. The turning point came when a small group of protesters, some masked and armed with makeshift weapons, began vandalizing property and clashing with police. This sparked a chain reaction, with police responding with force, using tear gas, pepper spray, and riot control tactics to disperse the crowds. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, with clashes erupting throughout the downtown core. Images of burning police cars, shattered storefronts, and protesters being beaten and arrested flooded the news. The violence shocked many Canadians, who were accustomed to a more peaceful and orderly society. The G20 protests in Toronto became a flashpoint, highlighting the growing frustration with globalization, economic inequality, and the perceived heavy-handedness of law enforcement. The events of that weekend left a lasting impact on the city, raising questions about the balance between security and civil liberties and the right to peaceful protest in an increasingly interconnected world. We all remember this one, 2020, Minneapolis, Minnesota. The world watched in horror as George Floyd, an unarmed black man, was killed by a police officer kneeling on his neck. His death, captured on video, ignited a firestorm of anger and grief, sparking protests that quickly spread across the United States and around the world. The initial protests were raw, emotional, and overwhelmingly peaceful. People of all backgrounds marched together, demanding justice for George Floyd and an end to systemic racism and police brutality. The sheer scale of the protests was unprecedented, with millions taking to the streets in cities and towns across America. There was a sense of urgency, a collective cry for change that reverberated throughout the nation. But as the days turned into weeks, the narrative began to shift. While the vast majority of protesters remained peaceful, a smaller element engaged in violence, looting, and vandalism. The media coverage, often focusing on the most dramatic images, contributed to a perception that the protests were inherently chaotic and destructive. This in turn fueled a backlash from those who saw the protests as a threat to law and order, further deepening the divisions within American society. The situation was further complicated by the response of law enforcement. In some instances, police used excessive force against protesters, indiscriminately firing tear gas, rubber bullets, and pepper spray into crowds. These actions, often captured on video and shared widely on social media, only served to escalate the tensions and erode trust in law enforcement. The 2020 George Floyd protests were a watershed moment in American history, exposing the deep-seated racial inequalities and systemic injustices that continue to plague the nation. The protests sparked a national conversation about race, policing, and the role of protest in a democracy. While the violence and destruction that occurred during some of the protests cannot be condoned, it's essential to remember that these actions were a symptom of a much larger societal problem. Across the globe, another fight for justice was unfolding. 2019, Hong Kong. Millions took to the streets to protest a proposed extradition bill that would have allowed Hong Kong residents to be extradited to mainland China. The protesters saw this as a direct threat to their autonomy and freedoms, fearing that it would erode the rule of law and open the door to political persecution. The initial protests were remarkable for their size and peaceful nature. Massive crowds marched through the streets, chanting slogans, singing songs, and holding up signs demanding the withdrawal of the bill. There was a palpable sense of unity and determination, with people from all walks of life coming together to defend their city and its unique identity. But as the protests continued and the government refused to budge, the situation began to escalate. Clashes between protesters and police became more frequent and more violent. Protesters, many of them young people, resorted to using makeshift barricades, Molotov cocktails and other projectiles to defend themselves against police advances. The police in turn responded with tear gas, rubber bullets, water cannons, and even live ammunition in some instances. The images of Hong Kong engulfed in tear gas, with protesters and police locked in a seemingly endless cycle of confrontation, became a symbol of the city's struggle for democracy and autonomy. The Hong Kong protests were a testament to the power of peaceful resistance, but they also demonstrated how quickly such movements can descend into chaos when met with state repression. The protests highlighted the deep political divisions within Hong Kong society, as well as the growing tensions between the city and mainland China. The events of 2019 left an indelible mark on Hong Kong, raising serious questions about its future and the future of democracy in the region. Back in Europe, another wave of unrest was about to erupt. 2011, London, England. A peaceful vigil for Mark Duggan, a young black man shot and killed by police, spiraled into days of rioting and looting across England. The initial vigil was a somber affair, with mourners gathering to express their grief and demand answers about Duggan's death. The atmosphere was tense but peaceful, with people sharing their stories and calling for justice. However, as the evening wore on, the mood began to shift. Frustration over Duggan's death, coupled with underlying social and economic grievances, boiled over into anger and violence. A small group of protesters began clashing with police, throwing bottles and other projectiles. The police, caught off guard, struggled to contain the situation. The violence quickly spread, with rioters smashing windows, looting shops, and setting fires. The unrest spread like wildfire, with similar scenes playing out in cities across England. The riots shocked the nation, revealing a deep undercurrent of anger and frustration, particularly among young people who felt marginalized and disenfranchised. The government's response was swift and severe, with a massive police crackdown and thousands of arrests. The riots sparked a national debate about the causes of the unrest, with many pointing to economic inequality, social alienation, and a lack of opportunities for young people. The 2011 England riots served as a stark reminder that even in seemingly stable societies, simmering tensions can erupt into violence when triggered by a specific event. The riots left a lasting impact on the country, prompting a reassessment of social policies and the relationship between the police and the communities they serve. Look, it's clear that the line between peaceful protest and chaos can be incredibly thin. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. These 5 instances, while just a snapshot of history, offer a glimpse into the power of social movements, the potential for escalation, and the challenges of maintaining order in the face of widespread unrest. It's important for us to remember that behind every protest, every riot, every act of violence, there are real people with real grievances. Understanding the complexities of these situations, the motivations of those involved, and the societal factors at play is crucial if we want to build a more just and equitable world. If you found this exploration into the chaotic side of protests insightful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future videos. Give this video a like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share it with your friends. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching.